Welcome back, everybody. We now have the famous and wonderful Nick Marchmont to give you a talk on alchemy and the birth of modern science. Is this mic on? Some of you will have seen his talk at Sunrise Celebration, where he did an amazing masterclass in sacred geometry, and there's some evidence of it still up there, actually, as we can see. So please give a warm welcome to Nick Marchmont.
Thank you very much, folks. Thank you very much all for coming. Yeah, I am to give you a brief intro into what is admittedly a really huge subject, and this picture really kind of sort of sums it up in its own way. It shows a guy that's living in a fully fledged world that's got kind of towns and villages and trees and the sun and the stars and everything, but his kind of body and his left-hand logical side and everything's all in that world, but his head and his right intuitive hand, if you like, is reaching out into another world which is expressing itself in a completely different way. And that is what really the alchemists were looking at. Effectively, what we're talking about is the perfectibility of the human spirit. It means that in the end, all of us are alchemists. But at the beginning, when alchemy first came about, that wasn't really the case. It was a very specialist thing. It's, the writings came to us from via ancient Greece, from Egypt. We know they came from Egypt. What we don't know is where the Egyptians got them from, but it's highly likely that, like everything else, they came from Sumer or from ancient Iraq. That's where a lot of our ancient myth stems from originally. The practice arrived in medieval Europe from Arabia. It's been the subject of more than 100,000 books, which is more books than any other single subject, it's said. And it's been described both as the mightiest secret ever possessed and the history of an error. As usual, for every expert, there's an equal and opposite expert. So for everybody that's saying one thing, there's somebody that's willing to demonstrate the contrary. We're going to be looking at, roughly what alchemy is, what the process is. We're going to be looking at some of the symbols that are used in it, because they're important. And we'll be looking at one or two of the main players in it as well. One of the guys who've really made progress and made their name, although there have been tens of thousands of them through history. We don't really know where the word comes from. Some people think it means it comes from art of the Black Land, and that the Black Land refers to Egypt because of the soil that's deposited every year as the Nile floods and makes the land fertile. I prefer personally the legend which said that in ancient times a race of giants married spirits, and the resulting offspring were exiled in the material world. And these exiles taught their wisdom without discrimination to whoever asked. And they've been mentioned by lots of quite famous and reliable historians, these characters. So Clement of Alexandria wrote of them and described them as teachers and masters of metallurgy, biology, magic and astrology. These are often the subjects that come up when we're talking about these characters. Tertullian described the output of these guys as the teaching of fallen angels. And the knowledge of these characters, the knowledge of these, if you like, exiled entities was said to have been written down in books, and those books were called chema. So I prefer the story that alchemy comes from that word, alchema, the books, that all of these secrets were written in. Now, we have a tendency to think, don't we, that it's just a matter of turning lead into gold and that there wasn't a lot else going on. Well, if that was the case, I don't think it would have been of so much interest to people throughout history as it has been. This is a picture of the soldiers of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. These are in the dying days of the Roman Empire. It had pretty much collapsed. Yep, certainly can. It pretty much collapsed and then kind of more or less sort of tried to revive itself. And there are a couple of emperors at the end, of whom Diocletian was one, who really put the screws on everybody to try and stop it from falling over sideways. So this is Diocletian's soldiers burning Egyptian alchemical books and giving the alchemists themselves a hard time. The Chinese emperor forbade the production of alchemical gold in 144 BC, and it obviously worked really well because the Chinese emperor did it again in 40 AD, so 280 odd years later. Our own Henry IV tried to prohibit all alchemical activity in the 1400s, but his successor, Henry V, encouraged the production of alchemical gold. Cynics suggest that the reason why Henry V wanted to encourage alchemical gold making was because he had soldiers in France, and that he didn't only want to undermine the people, he wanted to undermine the currency as well. So you see, if you're making slightly iffy gold and you're fighting in another country, you can use it over there. So however we view alchemy today, it was at one time a subject of great and political interest, obviously. Kings, princes, emperors, they've all had a say in it at one time or another. Trouble often accompanied the state alchemy, mostly from the authorities. Sometimes it was the result of the alchemical project itself. If you discover oxygen, say, or gunpowder, and you don't know what it is, it can tend to lead to some slightly surprising effects. But most of their problems came from the church, from emperors and monarchies. They were mostly the people who interfered with the work. This particular picture is a depiction of an alchemist being tortured by a character called Christian II, somewhat inaptly named, I think. He was Elector of Saxony. This shows, you can see there's numerous people helping him. There's an alchemist there, and he's got spikes through his legs. He's got like a pole through his wrists, which are tied together. It's all held up here on a kind of wheel, so they can basically kind of spread him all apart. Several people are obviously willing to take a bit of cash to try and get whatever information might be worthwhile out of this poor character. This isn't actually Alexander Seton being tortured, it's somebody else, but Christian made a bit of a habit of torturing alchemists. As you can see, he invested a lot of time in people and things to do it with. And one of the guys he did torture almost to death was a character called Alexander Seton. And he's one of many alchemists, well, certainly several, I'd say, who over time have apparently managed to produce the Philosopher's Stone. And Christian so much wanted the secret out of him that he tortured him almost to death. But actually what saved Seton's life was the fact that Christian became convinced that if he killed him, he'd kill the secret of this transformation with him, so he let Seton live. But this is the sort of thing that happens to a lot of alchemists, as we're going to see. They did get themselves into an enormous amount of trouble, and not for nothing did Albert Magus, who was a sort of 12th century alchemist around the end of the 1100s, he advised his fellow alchemists to avoid having anything to do with princes and noblemen, a piece of advice which was extremely sound and was singularly ignored by practically everybody that we're going to be looking at in this talk. The church never actually went so far as to make alchemy a heresy, but it did treat it with pretty much a stiff broom, and it really wasn't going to let anybody get a good hang of it. The church, I think it was kind of interested, a bit like the papacy is now, a bit like interested in the science and stuff, but it was not interested in having people thinking for themselves. That was their main problem. So if we come to one of the greatest English alchemists, just as an early look at one of these characters, this man really sums it up. There was a book written by a chap called James Blish. The book was called Dr. Mirabilis, and it's a fictional account of an alchemist, but it was based very much on the life of Roger Bacon, whose name come down to us as Dr. Mirabilis. That's what we know him as. Wonderful teacher. He was a Franciscan, and he was a champion of the scientific method. It's important that we understand what that means. The scientific method was preceded basically by Aristotle. Obviously, I have to make all of this very simple, but the church and Aristotle became established at the same time. And Aristotle did loads of really brilliant work. Loads of things that he said were true are still true now. But like all people who are speaking a truth, he had ideas around the outside that weren't quite right, you see. So the idea that they say 7 planets, there can only be 7 planets because there's only 7 holes in the human body. That was the kind of way it went. They were using logic to sort their world out. So Aristotle might say, and I think this is a true one, obviously I wasn't there, but Aristotle would say, for example, that flies have 4 legs. The scientific method would be to pin a fly to the table in front of you and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it has 6 legs. Well, up until a point that didn't work, because Aristotle said it had 4 legs, so it had 4 legs, and that was it. The scientific method comes about when people start using more than logic to look at their world, and they start going, well, hang on a moment, what happens if I turn that down and turn that up a bit? Does this turn out to be true? This was one of the first men to do that, and he did it really big time. You can imagine he was so unpopular with his superiors that they tried to keep him, I don't know, walking the tortoises and doing the vegetable gardening, and they kept blunting all his pencils and making paper wet and stuff. Almost anything, in fact, to stop him writing stuff down. So he was a recognised polymath and a thinker because of all the stuff he did write down, effectively the first scientist. And as a result of that, when you're out on the edge and people don't understand what you're doing, it looks like magic, doesn't it? So he gets himself a reputation as a sorcerer and a wizard, and consequently he endured some considerable time in prison. But he was also credited with the original invention of the microscope, which means grinding lenses. This is in 1200, you know, in the so-called Dark Ages. Pontoon bridge, made some really spectacular pontoon bridge, apparently. And a tank. When I first read that, I thought, really? Roger Bacon, a tank? Surely you must be joking. Since then, I've been down to the British Museum and seen 5,500-year-old friezes of temples in Sumer, and you can quite clearly see engines for taking cities apart. You can see machines with wheels that look like that are pulling bricks off these ancient palaces. So probably even he was coming up with an idea that had already been used when he came up with the idea for the tank. But nonetheless, the microscope, the pontoon bridge and the tank, those are pretty amazing things to be coming up with in the 1200s, do we not think? It certainly came as a bit of a surprise to me. He was also said to have gained much knowledge and learning from the devil and to possess one of these black mirrors that enabled him to see into the future and sort out, effectively do what we'd call remote viewing now. John Dee, a character we're going to see a little later in the talk, had one of those as well, and his is still in the British Museum, I think. Anyway, this doctor, this marvellous teacher, his fellow Franciscans were so convinced that he was having truck with the deviant that on his death, his books were nailed onto the shelves where they were found and left to rot. So we call a man wonderful teacher, and that's what we do with his materials. Alchemists use many symbols in their work, partly to borrow whatever influence could be gained from the symbol, and partly, of course, to maintain the mystery of their art. Also, you're going to tend to use a symbolic language, aren't you, if somebody's going to be chasing after you to try and squeeze your nuts every time you come up with a decent secret. So it's kind of magic. They're kind of using magic like we all do. We use symbols to hang all sorts of ideas onto them so that we can remember them at times when we need them, so we can remember complex ideas. Well, that's what these were for. Some of them are very ancient, as we'll see. We can't look at too many, but there's the Ouroboros, the symbol of the dragon eating its own tail. It's a sign of the primal unmanifest. And we'll talk more about the primal unmanifest the 7 o'clock talk on Sunday when I'm talking about sacred geometry. Basically, the primal unmanifest is the face of the deep before spirit moved, if you like, before anything changed. The dragon's the symbol of that, and the symbol of the god Mercury. That's his Roman name. His Greek name was Hermes, messenger god. Not surprising, he shares some characteristics with Thoth as well. All of these characters are basically the same thing, but with different names in different times. The Ouroboros is symbolic of the eternal cycle of nature, feeding itself on its own tail, and it recreates itself by feeding on its own body. So it's symbolic of matter transformed, which is, of course, that's a major symbol of alchemy itself, the symbol of the transformation of one thing into another. The phoenix is a symbol of rebirth through fire. Medieval legend has the phoenix living in Arabia, but then flying to Egypt to undergo its ritual or symbolic death, and then the kind of the birth of its young or the arrival of its young. And this is one of the things about alchemy, the tales always go back to Egypt. All the time you find lots and lots of reference to it. The phoenix itself here, this one is underneath his wings. He's got two of the classical elements. He's showing fire and air, which are the two masculine elements. So there's probably a feminine alchemical phoenix. I can't remember what it's called, but I'm pretty sure there is one. The thing I found about the phoenix is I've got lots of images of them as a really beautiful golden bird with all of this, but it turns out they're quite often a small shaggy looking critter like this one, somewhat startled and surprised looking. And I suppose, you know, if your mum's just gone up in flames and left you in a smouldering nest and you're just there kind of smoking a little bit and wondering what you're going to do next, it's hardly surprising that that's the way they look. I found more small shaggy looking ones than I did bright and glossy ones. Two staffs, the rod of Caduceus and the rod of Asclepius. Asclepius is another Hermes, Mercury, Thoth figure. He's a Greek healer that was said to be so good that he could bring people back from the dead. That is obviously a major alchemical theme. Actually, fundamentally, the lengthening of life to immortality rather than the bringing back of people from the dead, although it is said they could do that as well. The rod of Asclepius always reminds me of the staff of Aaron, which is described as a single copper serpent, and was of course capable of huge healing, but was also used to spread all of the plagues through Egypt. We've somehow become more used to the rod of Caduceus, which is also known as the staff of Hermes. Of course, there's the other name for Mercury. In these times, it was primarily associated with the twin worlds of trade and commerce. Fancy that, in Egypt, the twin snakes associated with trade and commerce. But through the influence of the Kabbalah, astronomy, and alchemy, it slowly became tentatively connected with healing. And then in 1902, the US Army adopted the twin serpent motif as its medical symbol, and then in the Second World War, I think the American Navy followed up, and they adopted it as well. So this ancient symbol of trade and commerce somehow became a symbol for health, like it Very interesting, strange movement. My thing is, though, that it's actually a much older symbol than that, and that what it's getting back to now is a symbol of healing again, and that's what it was originally, because I personally think that these joining points where the snakes overrun each other are representative of the chakras, and I also think that the twin serpent motif is representative of an ancient shamanic knowledge of our DNA and the twin serpents that are hidden there, as well as lots and lots of other things. So although this particular staff might have crept its way out of trade and commerce and via the American military into healing, I think it's only finding its way back to where it was originally. And we do, of course, have an equivalent of the winged disc on the top of that one. They've chosen to make the disc quite small so that we don't notice it, but that's nonetheless what is normally on the top of the staff of Caduceus. Quickly?
Two brain hemispheres.
Right, that makes sense, and I would also go, they might not be the two brain hemispheres, they might actually represent the cerebellum and the cerebrum because of the way they work, but certainly I think that's what it is, yeah. Because they're both different aspects of human flight and the, you know, the marriage of light and matter that comes about within us. Thank you for that. Here's a whole load of them. Triangles, of course, at the top. Water, falling, fire, rising. People who know me well know that you don't really want to get me started on triangles because we'll never make any more progress on the alchemy. Mercury and sulfur. The alchemists believe that everything developed in the womb of the earth, that all elements kind of developed in the womb of the earth as a result of the mixture of mercury and sulfur. And the perfect balance of mercury and sulfur, when achieved, would result in the manifestation of the philosopher's stone. Now, this might seem like a pretty crazy idea until you read a book about stellar nucleosynthesis and how everything comes about in the heart of stars, and how nearly the whole shooting match started off with just simply hydrogen and helium, and a little bit of beryllium and a little bit of lithium, but not enough to talk about. And the thing is that all of those things have got to kind of burn and do their stuff and then get blown out and get sucked into second-generation stars. And in a second-generation star, out of helium and hydrogen, you start getting all of the things that we're made out of, carbon and nitrogen and the other things, other heavier elements. So they're kind of right. The idea of mercury and sulfur, it's like they're remembering this idea that everything's made up of maybe zeros and ones or whatever the two things is, and that it slowly but surely stacks itself up and becomes complex. And as it does so, it makes new things, which is what the whole geometry talks about, is how something goes from just being a simple thing to being complex. But this mercury-sulfur, the basic opposition there, is got all of that in it. What they thought about mercury and what they thought about sulfur are whole books in themselves. And once you start reading those and papers on it, you can see why it was they picked those. Mercury is quite clear because it kind of ran around on glass, but it's a metal. Obviously, it's going to attract an alchemist who wants to change something from one thing into another. The sulfur I'm not so clear on. Sun and the moon representing light and darkness, masculine and feminine, inner and outer, and all of that, all of those opposites, above and below, all of that. And Solomon's seal, the integration of opposites into a new whole through synthesis. So the integration of all of those opposites, the sun and the moon, light and darkness, shade, all of that. And they realised, the alchemists realised that oppositions, rather than being denied, needed to be brought into dynamic equilibrium. This is something that we've seriously lost in the modern age. I call it the soap opera attitude, where somebody says good morning to you and you say, what's the matter with you? You know, there is no longer any kind of, there's no idea that you can bring two opposing things together to get progress. The opposition to us seems to result in breakdown, whereas to these people, opposition resulted in progress. And of course that's right, isn't it? Because where opposition occurs, it occurs because we're interested in something. If we didn't give a damn, there'd be no opposition and the other person could do what they want. So in, say, a community, when two people come heads up, it's because there's something that matters, needs to be addressed, and it's a huge opportunity for progress. And these huge opportunities for progress we nowadays take more or less inevitably as collapse, I think. It shows quite a sophisticated understanding of the idea of transformation. These people understood that over time, that the fixed, not only were the fixed and the volatile not opposites, that they were balancing each other. You can't have a stick with only one end. But they realised that over time, the fixed would become volatile and the volatile would become fixed. Now, there's a whole lot of people that are in charge at the moment that have got no idea that the people that are running the economy don't know that that's how things go, you know. So they understood, you know. I mean, does anybody out there know what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, say? It's an old riddle. And the answer is that the unstoppable force stops and the immovable object moves. What's effectively happened there is the entire paradigm has changed. All the rules that applied beforehand no longer apply. Everything has stopped. A plus B might have equaled C up to that point, but now you can no longer tell what A and B are. They've changed into something else, and they certainly don't make C anymore. And this is the world the alchemists were working in. They felt that they could change things by concentrating on them and by working with them. And they used these symbols to help them do that. The synthesis of the two triangles, the falling and the rising into a new whole in Solomon's seal. Lots more about that in the geometry talk. So from the beginning, alchemy saw men and women as equal, even necessary partners in the work. Well, you don't see many women in this talk. I'm still trying to find more of the central women, because even though it was like that, and still is, that you needed both parts to pull it off, it seems that the men were the ones that did a lot of the writing. In the 16th century, Paracelsus added a third element. He added salt to this. And so we have this kind of polarity, if you like. You've got the polarity of the mercury and sulfur, which came to be associated with spirit and soul. This is where the church come in, if you like. They're going, the spirit and the soul is all that matters. It's the most important thing. You really don't need to worry about chicken curry and beer and all that kind of stuff. It's what happens next that's important. Well, Paracelsus said no. He said the body is what keeps the spirit, brings the spirit and the soul together. He said the body is the pinnacle of the manifestation of our spiritual entity, and that it's here and now that we should be concentrating on it. Well, you can imagine how popular that made him with the church. His real name was Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. And we can tell from that that he was an aristocrat. So he had a bit of money, quite useful in this sort of trade. Paracelsus means greater than Celsus. People say that his middle name, Bombastus, from that we coined the word bombastic, but I think that's actually something to do with stuffing cotton into moths or something. But anyway, he was bombastic because he called himself Paracelsus, which means greater than Celsus. And up to this point, Celsus was the best. You know, he was in there with Hermes and Thoth and Mercury and all the rest of them as a healer. But he's often described as the father of holistic medicine because his work with homeopathy and his belief in treating the whole person. This was an entirely new thing. He was a great believer in the power of the mind, and he believed also that there was an undeniable truth in the mutual nature of as above, so below. The nature, he believed that there was an echo between the heavens and the human. And his idea that the inner state of the entity can be changed by the introduction of external matter yields him a fair claim to being the father of allopathic medicine. So as well as kind of a homeopath who took into account your state of mind, your horoscope, all manner of other things, he also came up with the idea of, here, pop a couple of these, guy, you'll feel a lot better. Now, so as well as doing all of this, he gave it away to the free. He did this free. He was one of the first alchemists to actually take stuff out of the laboratory and give it to the people. And he charged the nuts off his friends in the hierarchy. So that also made him popular. Didn't seem to make any difference for him, though. Carried on regardless. Alchemists just were unpopular. So there's an interesting picture. See, this is the kind of image that gets the alchemist such a bad reputation. You've got this fierce-looking hook-nosed character with a wild beard and wings and a snaky kind of tail, and he's got Mercury and the sun and the moon over him, and he's got wings on his ankles that you can't quite see there. And I've got no idea what it means, but I just couldn't resist putting it in. There's actually quite a lot of images like this associated with alchemy, and I've no doubt they could probably stand up here and talk for a week about it. You'll be glad to hear that I'm not going to. So given images like that, why on earth should we care? You know, it's an ancient skill, it's gone by, we've got laboratories and physics and everything nowadays. Well, many of the fathers of modern science, people such as Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, were actively interested in the transmutation of elements, the balancing of internal through external elements, the tuning of the small to the large. These were really basic things to Newton and Boyle. And Isaac Newton was an alchemist, whose extensive records, including work on gems and perpetual motion machines, were sequestered on his death by his family. And I'm not sure we ever got to see those. You see, he was fundamentally not a physics man, he was fundamentally an alchemist. But he became the master of the Royal Mint, and he became one of the founding members of the Royal Society and all of that fluff. And that's what they want us to remember. And I'm not sure that his actual work in the stuff that mattered ever made it to us. Quite possibly hidden. So he's actually one of the fathers of modern science. Not quite the most modern, of course, as we'll hear in a minute, but the kind of the basic mechanics, the mechanical understanding of the world that we have at the moment comes from Newton, and he was an alchemist. He was one of the last ones on the border of physics, just before it all turned into science. People that we're mentioning in this talk, and certainly loads of the others as well, survive for twice as long as their contemporaries on average, and some of these people live to be 90 or 100 years old. We quite a struggle this time round, I think. One of my favourites is in the late 1400s, Sir George Ripley's alchemical laboratories were sending £100,000 a year to the Knights of St John, who, like the better-known Knights Templar, were frequently accused of being sorcerers and heretics. Now, £100,000 a year. One of the things I do out in the free world is I'm a bit of an actor, and we do a bit of Shakespeare on the stage. And a man called Tim Carroll, who is Master of Words at the Globe, comes and does workshops with us once a year and trains us to be better at what we do. And he says that at those times, that in equivalent money, that would be £100 million of today's money. So George Ripley's alchemical labs in 1400 were turning over £100 million a year to the Knights of St John. Amazing, eh? That makes you think that alchemy must have been something a bit different from what we have in mind, doesn't it? And the Knights of St John were like the Knights Templar. They were very, very rich and very, very influential, and nobody knew where they were getting their cash from. Well, the books seem to suggest they were getting it from alchemists or from alchemical means. Ripley is another of those famous ones who appears to have really either been able to pull some spectacular stunts in the lab, or to have been able to sustain a tremendous lie under incredible pressure. And, of course, he was turning out 100 million a year in modern money, so, you know, he must have been up to something. So, loads of things came out of it. These are all things that came out of the alcoholics lab. Listen to him. Coming out of the alchemist lab. Alcohol distillation and porcelain, both end of the pub, in and out, they came out of the alchemist lab. The bain-marie. Maria Prophetissa is one of the famous lady alchemists of the past. She's actually described as the mother of alchemy. In a lot of schools, she's believed as the person who first brought it about. And she's described, I've seen her described as a legendary character and as a semi-mythical character, and I've seen her described as being born anywhere between 100 BC and 100 AD. She's certainly attributed with developing a lot of the material that are used in alchemical laboratories when we get to Shakespeare's time, especially the bain-marie, which is the ability to warm something in water rather than putting a direct heat against the bottom of it. It's the stuff they use for ruining your food in the pub when they put it all there and let it all dry out. It's also the way of making sake work properly. You put it in there and you warm it up in a bain-marie until it's at blood temperature and then drink it then, and it works loads better. Sodium nitrate used in rocket propellants, weed killer and explosives, I think. And of course, phosphorus. We've got two sorts of phosphorus. You've got the red one that's used in matches. It's a kind of combustible non-metal. The white phosphorus, which ignites in the air, glows in the dark, and sticks to things. That's the one that the Israelis claimed not to have been using on the Palestinians a couple of years back. Very, very difficult to deny using something that bursts into flames in the air and glows in the dark, I would have thought. And as a result, it was eventually showed that they are using it for that purpose. They claim it's for lighting things up so they can see what they're getting at, of course. So, what is it? It's said to have been brought to Earth by Hermes Trismegistus. Alchemy, magic and astrology, the Hermetic arts. And this is a very interesting thing that I'm only just starting to get involved in. I'm starting to realise that there has been a major subculture of this sort of stuff running on for so long. And a lot of the people that we look at today were obviously actively passing things on to each other. And there was, in fact, an attempt, it seems, to try and, right back then, to try and establish some sort of sane world based on kind of like, you know, what human beings might actually want. But that it was overcome by the monarchies and the people for whom the alchemists were working. And I'm only just starting to get a flavour for that now, but this is a picture of Hermes Trismegistus. It's a fine picture, and it's on the, it's a mosaic, and I think it's on the in the entrance hall to the Siena Cathedral, to one of those fantastic medieval cathedrals. And I think that's really fine there. You actually see a marriage between alchemy and the church, which was there really in the beginning. The goal of Western alchemy was the production of the philosopher's stone. This guy, Hermes, was thought to have been a priest in Old Kingdom Egypt, which is where the Egyptian collection comes in here. The goal of Western alchemy is the production of the philosopher's stone, which confers the ability to turn base metals into gold. It's important to realise that that's just the test of the stone. Its actual purpose is to increase your spiritual welfare, prolong your life, lead you towards immortality, whatever. The reason why gold is used as a symbol is, of course, because gold is the only metal, if you put it in water, it doesn't rust, and nor does it sort of rot away in the air either. So it's regarded as impermeable, it is. This is another picture of Hermes. This is your alchemist picture of Hermes. So there's your same picture from the church. This is what they preferred. Interestingly, we've got several of our images here. We've got some 3 chakra versions of the caduceus staff here. You remember the other one had 7. He's got a symbol for Mercury over his head. He's wearing a crown. He's got the sun and the moon either side of him. He's got the wings of a presumably gone phoenix underneath him. We've got 2 characters as well. We've got the one standing on your left. He's all buttoned up nice and braced round the knees. You see he's got his little fist behind him and his sword's ready. He's got the Asclepius staff there, the single snake on it. He's also wearing a crown. But you can see he's used to the fencing, whereas the guy on this side is kind of all badly kind of protected. He's got his guard in the wrong place. He's got your kind of sword in the wrong place. He's got the standard scraggy-looking phoenix on the end of his sword. He's got a big beard, and he's got what appear to be growths on his left arm. So what's happening here is another of the major things that alchemy represents, and that is the wild man and the civilized man. There's the one who stays in the compound and brings in the goods and kind of like helps look after whatever it is that needs doing on. And then there's the wild man who lives in the woods and frightens the children. And of course there's the wild woman and the civilized woman as well. And again, these are balancing forces in alchemy. They're to be brought into equilibrium. You're not supposed to hunt the woodman until you've killed them all, so that there's only people living in cities. And this is a very, very rich picture. Once again, you know, it's a bit odd, I'd say. So they had a taste for the odd, I think. Here are the 4 classical elements. All of us, I'm sure, in this field, I bet there's absolutely nobody here who's not familiar with the earth, the idea that everything's made out of earth, air, fire and water, and that there is a 5th element called ether, out of which all of these are somehow construed. Empedocles was rumoured to be the first person who wrote that down in the 5th century BC, which is when a lot of important stuff was first written down. And he reckoned the 4 elements were governed by strife and love. This is another main alchemical theme because, of course, they bring about change by heating things firstly, but also by mixing things together and then by pushing them apart again. And their theory is, of course, that this is how the whole cosmos happens. And again, they're right. All these things get mixed together and blown apart. And as we heard, then they get moved back into the sun and turned into different things and blown apart. Strife and love. They were exactly right. They had the words, they didn't have the maths. They probably had the telescopes by now. So that's Empedocles, that's earth, air, fire, water and ether. Aristotle was, this gives you some idea of how clever Aristotle was. They were very interested in trying to work out how things changed. They could see that things went rusty. They could see all manner of things changing into other things around them, and they wanted to know why it happened. And so he came up with this idea of hot and dry and wet and cold. Now, of course, it wasn't Aristotle's first idea. We know from Chinese medicine today that it's thoroughly ancient as the I Ching, as ancient as the Maya Tzolk'in, the hot, dry, wet, cold. But I think it was Aristotle who first applied it to the earth, air, fire, water thing and suggested that you could, by drying fire, you could get earth, and by heating air, you get fire. And so he connected each of the elements. So fire's connected with hot and dry, earth's connected with dry and cold, water's connected with cold and wet, and air's connected with wet and hot. And those relationships also helped to define a way in which they could start debating the way things change. Now, some people say at this point, they go, well, they're not elements, are they? We know that there's hundreds of elements now. Well, we've still only got gas, liquid, solid, and plasma, which is what these very much represent. And those are the elemental forms still, 4 elemental forms. So once again, the alchemists were clearly working with the right idea. Also, it has to be said, our modern day alchemy's got to the point where we are now producing elements, new elements. There's a whole 2 new rows of elements at the bottom of that elemental table, and they're elements made by humans, right? Now, up until this point, new elements have had to come out of the hearts of stars. So if you want to see where alchemy's taken us, we are now making elements. So that's where the idea of elements has gone in the time since the alchemists were around. this is a picture which I came across several times in the research for the talk, and it shows these two characters in the foreground wringing dew out of a towel for water, for work, for use in the great work, which is one of the reasons why the picture's here. Another reason why it's here is because in all four of the explanations that I read about it, nobody mentions the huge light or citadel type thing in the background. I don't know what it is, whether it's energy just pouring out of the 0-point field to Earth. It's clearly it's different from the sun and the moon because they're there as well. It looks like an energetic thing. The other reason why this picture's there is because it shows an old way of drawing things. You see these little flat things, strange shaped things in the foreground here. In these days, which is sort of before Newtonian science came along, things used to be drawn as they appeared on the landscape. It's only as we moved into the current scientific age and alchemy started becoming, if you like, started establishing the primacy of the really real in the world rather than looking at how it varied, that people started drawing a perspective. As our science started moving towards our own point of view, so did our artwork. We see a similar change happening in art later. But the whole artistic thing changed at about this point as the science changed. So we can see that our art, our science, our studies are changing. It's kind of alchemical in itself. All of the way a society is expressing itself is changing together in this kind of alchemical thing, not one thing leading another necessarily. Now, the idea of a unified worldview plays a central part in alchemy, so attention was paid to the positions of the stars, the phases of the moon, dreams were recorded, intuition was listened to. There was nothing that was irrelevant to the alchemist. Now that's true, I know of several people in here because I know what they do for a living. Loads of us still work that way. Most of the planet still works that way. It's only Western imperialism that's led us away from it. But these guys, they try to take everything into account. They realised that everything made a difference. Those of you that know biodynamic gardening and planting with the moon will know that this is the case. You can make tiny bits of difference by concentrating on a given element and another element and another element. Each thing makes for a little bit more success. And you know, everything does make a difference. The physicists made a really insane experiment where they wanted to find out how fast an iron bar fell to Earth. Then they realised that it mattered what shape the iron bar was. They had to make sure it couldn't be affected by neutrinos and magnets and all of that. And they ended up with a whole massive office block sized building to drop an iron bar in. And what they found was that the iron bar drops differently every time. Ta-da! You know, great, a whole lot of effort. The process itself is a three-stage process and sometimes four-stage. It starts off with a thing called nigredo, which is the base material, the black material, the lesser matter. It's a bit of a study in itself, the lesser matter. It's described, it's the absolute base, they all want it, but it's described as everywhere present, as worthless, vile, and despised by all men. So whilst being the key to everything, it's obviously something that nobody really wants to lay their hands on. For Newton, it was antimony, which is a strange element, which can be a metal or a non-metal. You can see why he liked that. For some, it was the human imagination. For Maria Prophetissa, the mother of alchemy, it was the confused mass of the alchemist himself that was the lesser matter. Now, that's a pretty Jungian idea from somebody who was around the time of Christ, I think. Quite impressive. The base material was taken quite literally by some people to be mud, dung, urine, practically any kind of excrescence, and that's what the mass of your alchemists were using. Practically any shit, literally. They would just try anything, you know. It shows how on the ball some people were. Second stage, albedo, to whiten or cleanse, to basically purify. There was then a kind of third stage in some schools, but the proper third stage is called rubedo, which is the manifestation of the philosopher's stone, the proper mixing together, in their case of mercury and sulfur, or actually the correct and rightful, mindful balancing of any opposites, I think. But mercury and sulfur yield this physical stone, which you can then use to prolong your life or become immortal or make people well. And it's thought that this kind of balancing is the direct revelation that humanity partakes of the divine nature. The realization, the actually making graspable of the knowledge that we have divine wonders sleeping within us. This is the secret they're going to. They have this suspicion that we're more than we appear to be, and it's what they're reaching for. And all works of transformation fit into the alchemical theme. Theatrical space, laboratory materials, the inner space of the alchemist, all of those things are places where change can be wrought. And it was felt that by making change in the laboratory, they were making changes in themselves. And symbolically, we see this all through our drama and our poetry, especially Shakespeare. Best story, we're all familiar with the old king, often dying, sometimes mad. He he represents the old material, the old consciousness, the lesser material, which shattered during Negredo. And the young prince, the king's son, his experience of all of this leads him to become the new consciousness or the new matter that struggles during Albedo to emerge shining and married at the end of the play. But of course, through time, one becomes the other. Time transmutes the young and the unformed into the old and the experienced. So the young matter becomes the old matter, the fixed becomes the volatile again. These seem just like stories that Shakespeare's telling us or that the poets are telling us, but they embed all of these secrets within them. And we'll actually see that some of the death of the king and his rejuvenation built into stone in Ireland in a few minutes. But by Elizabethan times, alchemists were seeing their own actions as reflections in miniature of the creation of the entire cosmos. Also got them into a bit of trouble with the church. We have a quick look at one or two particular ones. Giordano Bruno is the most important character to all of us here because he was one of the first semanticists come epistemologists, which means he was particularly interested in the nature of words and letters. What was happening was most of these early guys were churchmen because that was the only way you could get the leisure and the time and the materials and the money to do the study. He was a Dominican priest, this one, and he was primarily interested in the nature of ideas. Now, the nature of words is now coming up in front of all of us. If there's anybody in here who's into the Freeman material, there's a whole lot of people on the planet now who've realised that we're all using the wrong dictionaries when we're looking at contracts and things, and that the entire way we're being run is completely different because the people that are in charge have got a different dictionary from us. Well, this is one of the first characters that started looking into that. And he got himself, as a result, a reputation as a magician, especially his ability to execute huge feats of memory. They were all pretty good at this. Seems a good way to get into the mind of a king or a queen or a noble or something, is to just show them that you can remember more than they can, which what with the gout and everything isn't difficult. But actually this guy could remember loads of stuff. He was really good at it, hundreds and hundreds of items through mind mapping. He didn't get on so well with Queen Elizabeth. She thought him subversive and dangerous, but in his turn he didn't like the court or the English because he thought them crude, and in those days they were. London needed immigrants in those days because people were dying there faster than they were being born. If you wanted to be somewhere lovely and well informed and all of that in these days, you needed to be in the Alhambra over in Spain amongst the Moors and the Arabs. I think we were still making cider with rats over here at that time. Bruno, listen to this. Bruno, this is from Bruno's writings. Obviously it's translated, but I love this. Close your eyes and tell me it's not from a third millennium physics paper. He says, this entire globe, this star not being subject to death and dissolution, annihilation being impossible anywhere in nature, from time to time renews itself by changing and altering its parts. There is no absolute up or down, as Aristotle taught, no absolute position in space. But the position of a body is relative to that of other bodies. Everywhere there is incessant relative change in position throughout the universe, and the observer is always at the centre of things. Now that's quantum physics without the maths. That's a really good summary of relativity theory and a lot of things that we think nowadays. He was also a great chain theorist, which is what came before Darwin, came before evolution, and he deduced not only that there must be other planets out there, but that there were probably other life forms on them. He also said that Christianity is not rational, that it's philosophically unsound, and that it disagrees with other religions. He stated also that revelation through faith has no scientific basis, and further, that parts of the then widely accepted Aristotelian work were undermined by the new discoveries of science. Well, given all of that, it's not surprising that he was eventually burnt at the stake by the Inquisition for unhealthy points of view. Claudio Monteverdi, he did all of his alchemy on the stage. He was the father of opera, and they wrote it really big. They had amazing machines on the stage in those days to make it as big as possible, and he believed that everything that happened in the macrocosm could be projected onto the stage and so lensed into your audience, which is where we start seeing the alchemy of theatre. Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, this is a picture of him when he was Elector of Saxony, like Christian II earlier on. I did have a picture of him as the Roman Emperor, but he wasn't wearing a codpiece like that, so I chose this one. I thought, look at those truths. He got a lot of good work done. He protected loads of important people that the church were trying to hunt down. People like Johannes Kepler, John Dee spent some time with him, Cornelius Drebbel, who's the one we're going to come across. They all spent time there, and he was really interested in alchemy, more interested in spending time in it than he was in running his country. He didn't like the Catholics because he distrusted the monolithic nature of the power that they held. He distrusted the fact that it just had stayed the same for so long. He didn't like the Protestants because of their tendency to argue and bicker with each other and constantly schism into another group. And that meant that in the end he didn't really govern too well, and he sort of got blamed for the 30 Years' War, which was one of the most spectacular and destructive wars in Europe's history, even though he died 7 years before it happened. But hey, they still do that now. Let's blame it on a mad dead guy. Poor Rudolph. I think he did a lot for alchemy anyway. Tommaso da Campanella, he was another of these prodigies, the religious prodigies, like Giordano Bruno, and he was also brought into conflict with the ecclesiastical authorities. He fled Naples for Rome, then Florence, Venice, Padua and Bologna, but he wanted to hear his own language spoken. He wanted to go back to Calabria, so he did, and his mates shot him straight away to the Inquisition. So he found himself in their hands, and he consequently spent 27 years in prison. And he was tried 5 times, repeatedly tortured, and then he was named author of a book that was published 30 years before he was born. Doesn't change, does it? It really doesn't change, but you can see why we ended up with 100,000 books on alchemy if they kept locking him up for 27 years and giving him plenty of crayons and paper. But he wrote books on loads of stuff. He wrote, where have we got it? Politics, philosophy, monarchy, atheism, metaphysics and theology. And his is a great story because in 1626, get this, Pope Urban VIII had rumour that somebody was putting a spell on him, and he didn't want, having his faith was obviously very strong because he went straight down to the prison of the Inquisition where he got this guy, dragged him in there. And he said, look, can you do anything about this? So Tommaso goes, yeah, no problem, your popehood. Consider it done. And of course, whatever the spell was that was being cast on Urban VIII didn't have an effect, and he thought Tommaso had done it, so he let him go. So Tommaso burned it hot foot straight over to Louis XIII and ended up in the Abbaye Saint-Honoré under the care of Cardinal Richelieu from the Three Musketeers fame. So he's one of the few alchemists who actually lived to a ripe old age. They gave him one chance to get out, and that one did actually run. The funny thing about him is that he maintained that basically, he wanted to prove that all worldly powers should serve the church and all secular science should be subservient to religion. So he was locked up for all that time, even though he believed completely the opposite thing from the other guy, which I suppose just goes to show that nobody likes a smart ass. Actually, it's probably that the church were actually the teachers at the time, and they knew what they wanted to teach and they knew what they didn't want to teach. And these people really were. They weren't just locked up. When they were actually in their monasteries, that description I gave of Roger Bacon being kept in the veg garden and kept away from the quills and everything, they did do all of that as well. Lock them up in dark spaces, keep them cold, all of that kind of thing. Drebbel, Cornelius Drebbel, one of my favourites. He invented the submarine. He did. The first submarine he made was a 6-oared model. This one's a bit of an inaccurate drawing. He demonstrated a 6-oared model in front of King James in the River Thames, kept it 30 feet under the River Thames for something like 3.5 hours, which is a pretty clever thing to do. One of the things that strikes me about Drebbel is nobody knows how the hell he got oxygen into his submarine. And if you look at the more honest websites, they tell you they don't know. The BBC website says he had these kind of tubes running up from the submarine to the surface. Well, maybe he did, but it's not much of a submarine, is it? They were really interested in this device. One thing is that he was a friend of Michael Sendivigius, who was a guy who was thought to have discovered oxygen 150 years before we started fighting about it in Europe. So, but even if he had, it's difficult to imagine how they would have compressed it and got it in there. But anyway, later he came up with a 6-oared submarine as well. He also came up with a perpetual motion machine. That's what got him the job of chief alchemist in Rudolph II's court for 10 years, was he had this amazing thing on kind of pillars. It was a load of spheres on pillars, and it told the time, date and season, and it didn't need winding up. So it looked to all and sundry like a perpetual motion machine, but being quite a shrewd guy, what it was, in fact, was a load of clockwork devices enclosed in little enclosures, and the clockwork was being rewound by changes in air pressure. So Drebel was quite ingenious, and he made a fair bit of cash. He was a bit of a man's alchemist. He made a lot of explosives and bombs for the Navy, something the Elizabethans were very interested in. But he died the disappointed and impecunious alehouse. But at least he had an alehouse, which is more than most of them died with, I think. Robert Flood was the son of Elizabeth I's war treasurer. Now, he was a character. He was interested in architecture and especially the theatre as well, and he was probably responsible for the design of the globe, and he did huge memory feats on the back of that. But he successfully studied medicine, but he had leanings towards Paracelsus, which means he was a bit of a homeopath, and that delayed for ages his entry into the Royal College of Physicians. They wouldn't let him in. The members of the college distrusted his esoteric and mystical speculations and found him arrogant and defensive. Well, I shouldn't think he was too keen on them either. He ended up, once established, Flood ran his own laboratory both to prepare chemical remedies and to perform alchemical experiments. He used horoscopes when available. In addition, he established methods of diagnosis and was the first to posit the flow of blood and around the system and into the heart. So he did all of that. He also became pretty wealthy as well, but this idea that all souls, whether of men or of brutes, are none other than particles of the same soul, I think that if he hadn't been associated with Elizabeth's government, he would have been in deep trouble with the church there. As it is, though, he's one of the first who starts managing to voice heretical ideas and get away with it, because somehow alchemy and the church, science and the church are now separating themselves kind of from each other. Jacob Boehme there, he was the first one to say there's no need to go into a laboratory. Christ died on the cross for us. Hey, perfection, sorted. That's the perfection of the human spirit. One bloke died 2,000 years ago for our sins. And that, again, that was his take on the alchemical perfection of humanity, was that it had done by Jesus. John Dee is a name that we all know. He's pretty famous as a kind of magician. Actually, he became famous for being a stage magician, like so many of these people, very fascinated by the stage. And he created this giant scarab beetle that flew across the stage, and everybody goes, oh, that's magic, that is. And he goes, well, it's engineering, actually. And they go, yeah, still pretty magic. And he then sort of played on that, if you like. He also had a bit of a lucky break in as far as he put his bet on the right horse. He did a pair of astrology charts, one for Elizabeth and one for Mary. The one he did for Mary didn't look so good, and she was actually queen, and she didn't like what it said, so she locked him up in the tower. The one for Elizabeth was a little bit more rosy, and of course, as we know, Elizabeth was taught a plot to kind of see Mary off, I think it was. So in the long run, Mary did get seen to. I think she was assassinated, I can't quite remember. And that meant Elizabeth got on the throne, and John Dee was let out again, because she was the one he'd written a nice astrology chart for. So he became a major person in her court, and a bit of a scryer and all that. But his real strength came from a character called Kelly, who was a bit of a psychic. Kelly was actually running the equivalent of a modern-day call centre. He had dozens and dozens of psychics working for him, pouring all this stuff in. And John Dee and Kelly, between them, did huge tours of Europe. It was like U2 were coming. Tens of thousands of people would come and see these characters talk and basically shoot the breeze, I guess. I don't know whether they were doing experiments and blowing things up on stage or what, but they certainly attracted huge numbers of people. Also, John Dee, of course, was the original 007. He was a spy. That was the number Elizabeth gave to him. So Kelly and Dee were also out there doing ciphers and codes and moving information between governments as well. How much of an alchemist John Dee was, I have my doubts myself. He came up with a language called Enochian as part of what he did. And the Enochian was taken on by Aleister Crowley, thank you very much, as the language of his gods and demigods in his magical rituals. So Dee gets, if you like, a bit of third-party professional reputation from his association with Crowley. Once Elizabeth saw him off and didn't want him anymore, he went home and lived with Mother, where he built the single biggest library in Europe on esoteric and metaphysical works. Over time, alchemists have involved themselves in more or less everything: philosophy, medicine, metallurgy, dyeing and dyes, chemistry, astronomy, logic, warfare, botany, optics and maths. So you can see it's a really, really general term. Alchemy may have come to Egypt like so many things from Sumer. It's believed by many to be the land that gave birth to civilization as well as alchemy. But Maynard Keynes described Isaac Newton, who was born only 50 years after Shakespeare's death, as the last of the Babylonian and the Sumerian Magi. So, according to Keynes, who had a very, very sharp mind indeed, Newton effectively bestrode the whole thing. The birth of alchemy and Sumer with everything else, with writing and accounting and all the other things, right the way through to the birth of science through Newton. Newton, the last of the Babylonian and Sumerian Magi. Wow, what an award to get. Legend, as I've said, we heard about this tale of a kind of dead king, and they used to do things like kind of put the king in a burial chamber and then somehow try to move the spirit of the dead king or the dead champion through to the newborn prince or what have you. And it's thought that this was what was being written in stone in Newgrange, which is in Ireland, in southern Ireland. It's a megalithic structure built over 5,200 years ago, and after more than 5 millennia it's still watertight. It's been cleverly contrived. It's got a tunnel that runs into it, and then there's like a room in the middle that the tunnel runs into. It's got a massive, massive cantilevered stone over the whole chamber that runs into the corridor that runs in there. And despite the fact that these were Stone Age people, there are chamfered grooves in this huge cantilevered stone to take all the water away into the surrounding barrow. Also, it's somehow been chalked and sealed with something, and we don't really know what that is, but it hasn't washed out in all the time. There's 250,000 tons of washed river cobbles in there, and all the white stuff here is quartz. It's a very, very big place. Sorry? That's right, yeah. They rebuilt it, and one of the things they tried to do when they rebuilt it was to remove the light box, which is at the beginning of it, and luckily they didn't do that. They kept it all in the same place. The bottom bits so humans can get in, and the top bits so the light can get in. And these obviously are the carvings of our ancient ancestors here. Every 8 years, well, every year the winter solstice sun shines down there and it lights that tunnel around December the 21st. But every 8 years it does something really trick. It picks up the light of Venus. Now you can see how that tunnel's slightly snaky. They did that deliberately. They'd built many of these things before and they'd had straight tunnels. This one's deliberately got a snaky one. It's also got a slight rise on the floor. There's also really interesting acoustic properties. As you go in there, if you've got a drum at the end, the drum will get louder as you get to about 5 meters in, and then quieter. And then it'll get louder again and then quieter again. So the tunnel is also acoustically active. But once every 8 years, Venus, this captures the scattered light of Venus about 15 minutes before the sun rises on the winter solstice day. So the idea is that what would happen is you'd first of all get the grey light of Venus in the chamber, and then 15 minutes later you'd get the golden light of what then would have been a new year, of course, because the days would then be starting to get longer. And the idea was that during this Venus-Sol interplay, that the soul of the old champion or the old king, represented by the grey light of Venus and rebirth and new life and all of that, is moved into the new king, and represented by the golden light of the new year. And of course, anybody that was impregnated in the May or the Beltane celebrations would give birth at the winter solstice. So these things could have been connected together. But this is an alchemical myth, actually written into stone, and it's a really huge thing. But the other reason why we're interested in Newgrange is because in order to capture Venus once every 8 years, they had to know that this is what Venus was doing in the night sky every 8 years. Basically, planets, as they travel around the Earth, from Earth, they look sometimes like they're going backwards. That's because of our movement in relation to them. And they look like they have just a little kick backwards. Well, Venus has 5 of those around us in an 8-year cycle, and those 5 points that she stations above us make a perfect pentagon, pentacle. And the 5 signs are that: earth, air, fire, water, and ether is what it stands for. And also in the middle, because it's got another pentagon, it's figured that there must be the 6th element operating from there, which is taken to be love by a lot of people, but whatever really. So the guys that built Newgrange knew about this. The other thing is that, I'm going to go, we do come back to Venus in a minute and the way this works. That's an amazing thing for them to be able to capture. When you think that everything appears to be drifting a little bit, you'd think so, wouldn't you? That this tunnel would, after 5,200 years, have moved somehow, because Venus is in a different place, we're in a different place, and we return to that in a little bit. But we're reaching kind of the end of the talk, so we just get into the summary of one or two bits. It's getting quite hard for me to see my notes here, too. In alchemy, sees connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, which is something that modern physics is just catching up with. Modern physics recognises that the observer's role is vital in the outcome of any experiment, and that the observer, the observed, and the observational apparatus are one, which is exactly what we heard Tommaso writing earlier. Alchemy, like many other esoteric strands, proposes that matter can be manipulated through strong visual imagination. This is the idea that consciousness and matter are actually interrelating with each other. Actually, matter comes about as a result of its interaction with consciousness, but this is the idea that we can change matter by concentrating on it. And again, I reckon that most of the people in this field will believe that we can change the world by concentrating on it. Strong visual imagination. The Ouroboros, the eternal cycle of nature, recreating itself by feeding on its own body. Matter transformed. We see it every spring. Millions of sweet little baby birds and mice and all of that, and they're all out there. 99.99% of them are going to get eaten by the 0.1% that are going to make next year's babies. So that is nature constantly feeding on its own body, renewing itself, the picture of the Ouroboros. Now, you're entering a bit into Nick world here, because one of the things I had to read for this, one of the things I read for this was really boring. It was called the Gold Bulletin number 18, and it was about the importance of gold in alchemy. They said it wasn't. It was just so tedious. But for some reason, he finished it all off with an artist's impression of the fusion toroids of a reactor, and he called the fusion toroid a modern-day Ouroboros. This lovely idea, because it's kind of very much eating its own tail. And then, once I'd seen that, I remembered this out of John Martineau's little book of coincidence. This is basically a picture of, that's Earth in the middle. We've got a bigger picture of it in a minute. Let me just, there we go. You've got Earth in the middle, and round the inner circle is Jupiter doing these little retrograde loops round us. And this is what Jupiter looks like from Earth. If we were on Jupiter, Earth would be making exactly the same pattern in the sky. And then you see, round the outside, we've got Saturn, which has got a slightly different pattern. It loops back, goes retrograde many more times. And if we sat on Saturn, Earth would be making that pattern in the sky. So we've got these really fantastic dual dances being done by the planets. And notice that where they end, you can see it's just here is where that one ends. And this one ends about here. Can you see how those two cycles are each ending in slightly different places, which means the next time the set of curls is going to be moved slightly to the left or slightly down. So you'll end up with a really curly thing like a doily or a spirograph or something. Well, that means that whole thing's kind of moving through space, and I'm amazed that given all of this is barreling around. And I ran this past Mike, as Mick, my webmaster and the man who does all of the converters on my website. He also wrote a program that allows him to look at stars and dial them backwards and forwards in the sky, and he's checked all of this out. Somehow, everything is kind of hurling through space, moving, and yet staying accurately enough together for the light of Venus still to shine up what's effectively a Stone Age laser. That's what it's doing. It's making coherent light out of Venus for 5,200 years. The previous picture was there because I was struck by that's a picture of an actual toroid reactor with its little scientists in it seeing to it. And I was just really struck by how similar it was to the patterns of the planets as they fly around us. And that brings us to a character called Art Kunkin, one of my favourite people. Some of the older ones amongst us will remember him. He was the self-styled king of the hippies in the 60s in Los Angeles. He launched the Los Angeles Free Press. He took the whole of the Los Angeles narcotics department to court. He was fantastic, really busy character. Well, now he thinks he's come up with the secret. He thinks he's found what the lesser material is. And he says that he can now stay out of bed for sort of 36, 48 hours at a time on his computer and things. And you think, well, was it worth it? Well, what he's come across is you remember that the the lesser material that these people were working on was described as vile and worthless and despised by all men and really common, all of that. Well, he thinks it's pitchblende. And pitchblende is a sort of, it looks like a stone. It's a byproduct of the mining of gold and silver, so you'd just disregard it, wouldn't you? And what Art says is that it gives off what he calls non-ionizing radiation. Now, Mick the Moon tells me that non-ionizing radiation is the incorrect term, which it probably, if Mick says it is. So Art shouldn't have used that. But what Art meant was that there is a theory that life originally came about in Earth as a result of the gentle radioactive cycling of low-level radioactive materials on Earth, just slowly turning inorganic chemistry into organic chemistry as the simple becomes complex. And Art's saying that that's what's happening here. He's saying that that energy is still rocking forward in this pitchblende, and that you can put it, he puts it in a jar with pears and then eats the pears. So he's getting on a bit now, Art. And he also says the other thing he sorts out is he does one of the things we must be wondering. That alchemyrevealed.com is a good place to go and see what Art's doing, and he's now written his life story as well, which would be really good to read. I haven't read it yet. But he reckons that you can actually attract the principle of life out of stones, and from it you can make a cure. And he also says that there are museums that contain alchemical gold, gold that was not mined and has a different specific gravity. There are objects made of this stuff, and nobody can explain it. And then there's a big, see, that's in the British Museum. This is a piece of alchemical gold that's held in the coins and money department of the British Museum or whatever it is. And there's alchemical gold in other museums around the planet as well. I'm not sure what's different about it. Nobody's ever managed to tell me. One of these days somebody will tell me. But I'm aware that you can have differences in the number of electrons a metal's got. It'll have the same number of protons in its core, but it will have different numbers of electrons going around it. I know that they can have slightly different specific gravities as well and still be the same elemental self. But one way or the other, it is thought that they did manage to produce gold from less substantial metals. That is a coin that was apparently cast from gold that was produced in front of a prince, but I'm not sure how much we should put in that. And that brings us basically to the end. I leave you with a picture which is absolutely stuffed full of alchemical imagery and things, and some more of it you might be able to recognise now than you would have done to start with. In closing, I'd just like, on a personal note, I'd like to talk a bit about the alchemy of the stage, because it's the alchemy that I understand particularly. We do one Shakespeare play every year, and we generally start in April, and 5 or 6 weeks later it's on the stage and it's done and dusted. When we first read through it, you can see that most of the people who are reading it don't understand at all. But there are flashes of beauty and flashes of inspiration everywhere. It takes only a couple of weeks before the people are getting into their role. They're really getting a feel for it, and they're getting to understand the words. And you can watch it happening. You just watch this story start as being part of it. But it doesn't become itself until you put it on a stage. The words aren't truly burnt into your mind. The thing isn't truly itself until you've got it in front of an audience. And then for you on the stage, it's kind of really happening, you know? It's kind of really happening. If somebody doesn't turn up, you're really stiffed, you know? And we're constantly throwing challenges at each other on the stage now because we've realised that you don't want to do the same thing all the time. You need to keep it fresh. Now, my favourite people who came with Tim Carroll, they're Tim's theatre company, and they're called The Factory, and they came along once to do As You Like It, and they hadn't rehearsed it. They'd only been given their own, this is the way they did it in Shakespeare's time, they'd been given their own speeches and their cues, period. Nobody knew who was playing what. They hadn't rehearsed any of it. They just had to wait for their cues and then come on. It was a theatre they'd never played in before, and it was awesome, man. Then they had no props, no costumes, nothing. They nicked everything off the audience that they needed, which involved the audience and everything. Brilliant. The last time they came to us, they did The Seagull by Chekhov, which is a Russian play, and they worked with 12 translations to produce this, and their conclusion was that the best thing to do was make it up every night. So that's what they did. They did 3-hour Chekhov every night, and they made it up. And instead of having names like the magistrate and the magistrate's daughter, which is how Russian plays tend to be set up, they called themselves by their own names. and they wore their own clothes. Yeah? And before they started, they had a game of scissors, paper, stone to see who was going to play which part. Yeah? And then and I'm not joking, within 45 seconds of them starting, you just can't take your eyes off them. And that is alchemy. That is the perfectibility of the human spirit. You are somewhere else when you're with people who are doing that to you. You see more of how you can be, how your impressions are manipulated if you come to the sacred geometry talk on Sunday, see how your eyes can be fooled. My latest experience was a really great one. We did Romeo and Juliet this year, which is an exceptionally, I thought, oh God, do we have to? But actually I've quite enjoyed it. I prefer the fighting, but there's lots of people die in Romeo and Juliet. Anyway, we're doing it in a bar. We're doing it in a bar in the Hay Golf Club. And there's a kind of one of these 1970s sliding concertina type between two halves of a bar. This is kind of shunted across, and then we have like a curtain. And it's really amazing because what's going on here is there's a bar with people who are not authorised. There's us, the actors, you know, arsing about, drinking beer, waiting to go on. On the other side of the curtain, there's the other half of the bar, which is a theatre. It's authorised. Everybody that's in there is saying what they're told to say, and to those people, it's theatre. Now, in Shakespearean plays, nearly all the time, half of the actors are off the stage because the other half are on, and they do two families or two whatever. And so as a result, the bar is kept pretty well under control. There's golfers in there enjoying the 19th hole and having a bit of a sandwich, but they're keeping it quite calm because there's quite a lot of actors in there. But obviously, when you get to the end of a play, nearly everybody's in the bar and there's three stiffs on the stage. There's three bodies, and what happens then is people drip in one by one, and the bar empties of all the actors and they all go onto the authorised stage. And that was really amazing for us because we're going from being normal to being on the stage to being back in the bar. But what I noticed was as people disappeared one by one to find the bodies on the stage at the end of Romeo and Juliet, and the number of actors in the bar dropped, the bar slowly but surely became more and more and more of a bar until there was only 3 people left in the bar, and we were the dead ones. We were the ones that had been killed in the first half. And by then the bar was getting really noisy. And it really is like the illusion. There's this change happening as you're actually doing the drama. And that particular one was just fantastic to see how the bar became less of a bar when there were more actors in it, and more of a bar when there were fewer actors in it. And you just become aware. It changes so much. And then at the end of the play, you see these people going out and they tell you how it's the first time they've ever understood Shakespeare. And, you know, 8- and 9-year-olds telling you how much they've enjoyed seeing what you've done. And you've affected them with words that were written 400 years ago by a well-dead geezer. You know, it's amazing. This is the real thing of alchemy. We're the base metal, and we're becoming light. We're remembering that we are light. I'd really like to thank you all for being so attentive. I'll see you later in the weekend. No point in asking me any questions because I don't really know much about the actual thing. Thank you very much, folks. Excellent.
Nice one, Nick. Nick will be talking again on Sunday actually at 7 o'clock. Title of Sacred Geometry.
From the hyperspace, no previous experience necessary.
Nick's DVD.